The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
As if the world needed another reason to be on edge, Russia and NATO seem poised for real trouble over Ukraine. Tonight we'll find out why. Then, is Quebec's controversial Bill 21 prohibiting religious symbols something that the rest of Canada should push back on? We'll explore that too. It's Wednesday, January 26th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Troops on alert, diplomats packing up. Tensions continue to rise this week over Russia's stance towards Ukraine and what conflict there would mean to Western powers and global peace. With us for more, we welcome in Vienna, Austria, Velina Chakarova, director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. And here in Ontario's capital city, Robert Baines, president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, and Lucan Way, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Great to have you three on the program tonight for what is, unfortunately, a very timely conversation. Let us quickly review where we're at. 100,000 Russian troops amassed along the border with Ukraine. Families of American, British, and Canadian diplomats are leaving Kiev. Ukrainian authorities are doing their best to reassure people that a Russian attack is not imminent. But that's where I'm starting with you. Velina, do you believe that a Russian attack is imminent?
Absolutely, it's imminent, and this has been the case since 2014 when actually Russia invaded Ukraine. So we are talking currently about reinvasion, but I don't anticipate a military attack by Russia before February 20, and I will explain very shortly why. The Russian military escalation right now is a three-dimensional approach. First, it's against Ukraine, which must always fear an imminent military attack by Russia. Second, it's against the European Union powers, so to say, to show their geopolitical irrelevance because they cannot prevent a military attack from happening. But most importantly, it's also an approach that is actually aiming to position Russia in the long game, in the systemic rivalry between China and United States, to upgrade the positioning of Russia. And so to say, by showing a military muscle, Putin is trying to leverage right now against both the United States and China for different reasons.
Interesting. And we will follow up on all of those very interesting points as we continue. Okay, Robert, your view. Do you think an invasion is imminent?
I'd say that there's no doubt that there will be some form of invasion imminent. The question is how large. A lot of reports that I've read and the current updates about what are the Russian armaments and capabilities being shipped to the Ukrainian border, as well as to Belarus, suggest that a large-scale invasion may not be imminent immediately. But that's never really been Russia's game when we look at things in the immediate past. We have to think that Russia is going to be trying to take advantage of any opportunity to create division amongst the NATO members and those who are supporting Ukraine. The easiest way to do that would be to have a false flag operation where there might be a tussle between some Ukrainian border operation and some Russian service members, wherein it's not quite clear what is going on. Anytime there is something that is unclear, that is going to be the perfect envelope for Russia to be able to divide the alliance. And that's what they're always looking to do, is to try to make sure that NATO is not united. That's the main danger for NATO, and it always has been.
Lucan, we have two yeses to an imminent invasion. What say you?
So I'm going to hedge my bets and note that we actually really don't know. I mean, right now, the entire world is trying to figure out what's going on in one guy's head. This guy is Putin, who basically has almost no constraints on his actions. He can invade, he can not invade. I mean, Russia is such a system that, I don't think we don't really know what Putin wants. I don't even think the foreign minister of Russia knows exactly what Putin wants. I mean, I would probably, if I were forced to predict, I would, something along the lines of what you guys say. I think something short, either sort of hidden or ambiguous, but definitely something short, which he pulls back, sort of enough to sort of show that Russia matters, but not enough to unite NATO and cause real serious repercussions. That's what I
Well, let's acknowledge off the top here that nobody, you're quite right. Nobody knows. Only one person knows, and he's not saying yet. But we obviously want to hear what you three have to say, since you study the state of play over there a great deal, and we want to get a sense of where things are at. Valina, maybe I can get you to follow up on this. If there is an invasion, and you mentioned February 20th as a potential date, what does an invasion look like?
So I agree with my colleagues. First and foremost, there will be no full-scale reinvasion of the whole territory of Ukraine. It's going to be a limited operation, limited in scope and time frame. And why did I say February 20? Well, this is the end of the Olympic Games, and I mentioned that it's a three-dimensional approach. So currently, Putin sees this optimal window of opportunity to test the readiness of the United States for bilateral talks with Moscow. That's the first and most important thing. He wants to erase the European NATO members from the equation. He wants to talk directly to Biden. And it's actually about future concessions by Washington. If Washington, at some point of time in the long run, really intends to lure Russia away from China, that's the first thing. And secondly, Russia simultaneously coordinated diplomatically its view on Ukraine with China's view on Taiwan. Let's not forget that. That's happened in December, which I think is also important because this two-front scenario will create a lot of problems for the United States and for the American allies in the future, which is why I think that Putin won't actually consider a military attack before February 20, because he knows how important the Olympic Games are for China to actually project kind of a positive image following the last 2 years of pandemic. That's why I think if an invasion, let's say after February 20, and then in a very limited scope and time frame, because Russia cannot afford itself economically, financially, and also in military terms, a full-scale operation, which my colleague also explained in NATO terms. There will be, of course, a response.
Let me follow up with Robert on that. So let's understand if there is an invasion, or as Valina calls it, a re-invasion, because of course they did once already, sort of. Are we talking by air? Are we talking only tanks? Are we talking only soldiers? What are we talking?
Well, the possibilities are endless, and that is one of the main goals of Russia at the moment, is to keep everybody guessing. There have been several vessels that have been redeployed to the Black Sea. We have an airborne group that has been shipped off to Belarus, about 50 kilometers from the border of Ukraine. That is one of the reasons that a current training exercise going on in Belarus is such a challenge, because it does leave so much open. The only thing it doesn't leave open right now is the full-scale invasion we were mentioning earlier. It's unlikely that there would be actual attacks on the capital or on the individual cities. It would be much more likely something that is tried to keep on a very local level on the border, so that it keeps maintaining as much confusion as possible, and the clarity of the situation will not be immediately apparent to the allies, and thus, again, creating division on how to respond.
Lucan, do you have any sense about how many Ukrainians are prepared to die trying to keep the Russians out?
That's a great question. I think that one thing I think is that Russia government has my experience, has a very poor understanding of Ukraine. They tend to think that any Ukrainians who speak Russian will naturally welcome Russian invasion, but in fact, that's not the case. 90% of Ukrainians, according to a survey in December, support Ukrainian independence from Russia. Furthermore, the same survey showed that about 50% of Ukrainians are willing to resist in some form, through active military way or other form, Russian invasion. So I do think that if he does decide to sort of have a serious invasion, there will be serious ill consequences for Russia, serious guerrilla warfare, which would be, which would be bad for Russia.
Valina, can I get you on that? Do you have a sense about whether thousands of Ukrainians are prepared to die in order to keep the Russians out?
Well, let's start with the fact that already 14,000 Ukrainian soldiers actually fell victim to the military incursions and operations with a direct or indirect support by Russia over the last year since the incursions started, since the military conflict in eastern Ukraine began in 2014 following the annexation of Crimea. Millions of people were displaced, so both internally within Ukraine and also externally going to other European countries, for instance, such as Poland. So in a sense, Ukraine has been prepared since 2014, the population is actually very active and is very aware, but we still have to keep in mind that as it was also mentioned, the population on both sides, Russia and Ukraine, is not really fond of war. So the domestic factor probably will be also counterproductive in the case of Russia. So, of course, this will not be decisive if Putin decides to reinvade Ukraine. But I think that this will be decisive in terms of the scope and the timeline. And Ukraine will fight back. Ukraine will not stand alone, and Ukraine will also receive support, military support from NATO and non-NATO members.
Well, I'm sure the three of you noticed Fiona Hill's piece in the New York Times the other day. She had an op-ed. This was the former national security counselor under the previous president, I guess as Joe Biden calls him, under the former guy, who put the nature of the crisis this way. Sheldon, let's bring up this graphic and we'll read this excerpt. In the 1990s, the United States and NATO forced Russia to withdraw the remnants of the Soviet military from their bases in Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Baltic states. Mr. Putin wants the United States to suffer in a similar way. From Russia's perspective, America's domestic travails after 4 years of President Donald Trump's disastrous presidency, as well as the rifts he created with U.S. allies, and then America's precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan, signal weakness. If Russia presses hard enough, Mr. Putin hopes he can strike a new security deal with NATO and Europe to avoid an open-ended conflict, and then it will be America's turn to leave, taking its troops and missiles with it. Okay, Robert, you've heard the argument. What do you think?
Well, I think it's certainly got a grain of truth in it. The rest of the op-ed also mentions that Mr. Putin almost sees this as a binary situation, Russia and the United States. NATO is just an appendage. But I think that the clarity of it is the resentment aspect. I think that has, beyond anything else, become quite clear that Mr. Putin just resents what has happened to Russia over the past 30 years, the humiliation. And one always hesitates to make parallels with the 1930s and the Second World War all the time. But that kind of resentment, as was created by Versailles, is a very strong motivator, and it can be something that can help motivate the rest of a population. In Mr. Putin's case, I think it's crystal clear that he is resentful and wants to have revenge, as it were.
Lucan, is this a case of you did it to us and now I'm going to do it to you?
So I may be in the minority here. I actually am less sure that this intervention has much to do with NATO. Listen, I mean, Russia is interfering militarily in Ukraine for three main reasons. One, it has historical claims over Ukraine. Two, the Ukrainian government has consistently remained autonomous from Russian interference. And three, basically Putin can get away with it because the West can do almost nothing to prevent military invasion. So I think basically Putin is doing this because he can. And if Putin were truly concerned about NATO threat, it's not clear to me why he would engage in behavior that will almost certainly result in increased NATO troop presence right on Russia's borders. I mean, the United States has been talking about sending thousands of troops in the Baltics. I mean, furthermore, his behavior has dramatically increased domestic Ukrainian support for NATO. So either he's just insanely stupid and sort of provoking NATO, or he's playing four-dimensional chess, but it's also possible that he actually wants to increase NATO's threat, to use NATO as a domestic bogeyman to unite Russian population. Listen, NATO presents the perfect bogeyman. It looks really threatening. At the same time, it's in fact highly divided and also doesn't really want to hurt Putin. So it's the perfect bogeyman. He can raise it, but he knows that it's not going to hurt him. And unite Russians behind him.
Sure. One of the arguments we hear, Valina, is that NATO did not adhere to an agreement that was made more than 30 years ago when Mikhail Gorbachev said, we don't want any enlargement of NATO. You can't have Ukraine. And apparently, we're told the president of the day, George Bush the father, agreed. Promises were made, and Putin would say promises not kept. Does he have an argument here?
Well, as geopolitical analyst, I would say only this. In realpolitik terms, the strong always do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. This is, by the way, a quote from Thucydides. So NATO expanded only because it was the defense alliance of the winner of the Cold War. If the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, now probably largest parts of Europe would have been actually part of the Warsaw Pact, which was actually the collective defense treaty of the Soviet Union. So 7 other Soviet satellites were actually part of this Warsaw Pact. Let's remember that. Let's keep in mind that Putin also does not stick to his promises. And my colleagues already outlined some of the best examples. Russia is part of all frozen conflicts in Eastern Europe. Russia sees Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence. The Russian president is talking about spheres of influence 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and is withdrawing the map of Europe, not only in Ukraine, but also in Georgia. There is military presence in Transnistria near Moldova. There will be probably military bases in Belarus starting with this year. So the whole Eastern European region is actually seen as a buffer zone between Russia and the European Union members. And I will give you another example. I think that the reading of the Russian president is that America is going to retreat from Europe due to its own geopolitical calculations. These are calculations linked to the long game, to the Indo-Pacific global power competition. And I think that the Russian president is currently putting his conditions on the table. He wants to see a complete American retreat from Europe in order for Russia to get what it has been looking for in the last 30 years. So following
just follow up on that,
resentments.
Valina, if you would. We need to understand what a complete retreat from Europe looks like if in fact America were to do that. How does that look to you?
Well, we see the conditions by Russia have been published both for the United States and for NATO members. And it's correct assessment what my colleague said, that it's not about the European NATO members. It is really about agreeing with America on a bilateral manner, because Moscow knows America will put pressure on the European NATO members once they agree. I think that these conditions are absolutely impossible, as seen from this side of the Atlantic, as seen from the point of view of the European NATO members. That would mean a complete retreat of United States and NATO troops from all members of NATO after 1997. So these are basically all Central and Eastern European countries that actually joined the alliance following the collapse of the Soviet Union. From this point of view, from current point of view, this is absolutely impossible condition. But I think this is really about testing the red lines of America, what America would be ready to give as concessions in the long term, which is why I don't think that we will see actually the published response by the United States, which is due this week. And it's going to be a round of negotiations for not just this year, but for the years to come. But if the European NATO members do not start walking the walk in terms of European defense, in terms of providing for the European defense pillar within NATO, I think we are going to face a serious problem within the alliance in the long term, because at some point Europe might turn into a geopolitical backyard because it will be not able to defend itself against Russia.
Well, let me pick up on that and go to Robert and find out how unified you believe NATO is right now. We see the British are sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. Other NATO powers are. We're doing a little bit, although not necessarily lethal weapons. Germany, quite pointedly, has not. How do you understand Germany's attitude in this crisis?
Well, let me just, before I answer that, I have to address the Gorbachev Gentleman's Agreement. First of all, since the end of the Second World War, we have tried to build a rules-based international order that does not any longer acknowledge gentlemen's agreements. It runs by formal agreements. NATO is an alliance of 30 members now. Back in the day, it would have had fewer, but if there had been any kind of agreement like that, it would have been codified, it would have been in a communique, it would have been quite clear. Gentleman's agreement, not going to cut it. Mr. Gorbachev also did an article in 2014 saying there was no such agreement. So I just have to say that. On unity, look, unity is always the Achilles heel of NATO, of any military alliance. You think of the Iliad, one of our founding documents of global civilization. It's always problems in the command tent. And here it is the civil control of the military, which allows democratic governments to disagree on how to move forward. Now, that's fine as long as what we do decide to do is taken on together. In Afghanistan, you'll remember there were several problems with caveats, but in the end, we muddled through and remained united. It's a binary thing, NATO. Either we're all one or we're nothing. So that's the key. If we're talking about the challenge of Chancellor Scholz having to deal with local German politics, it has always been that way. The key of the alliance is to gather consensus and to push forward with that in a strong way. There's always going to be challenges on the sidelines.
Well, you raised local politics, and let me pick up on that with Lucan. We have a significant Ukrainian diaspora in this country. A lot of it actually not far from where you live. A lot of it's in the west end of Ontario's capital city. Do you think the government of Canada ought to be listening to that diaspora and sending more lethal weaponry to assist Ukrainians against a potential invasion?
I certainly think that ultimately what's going to prevent Russian incursion in Ukraine is that Ukrainians will make it incredibly costly for Russia to interfere. Because basically Putin, Crimea was the perfect situation, for Putin. He was able to satisfy Russian national demands, but it actually had absolutely zero cost for him. So anything that we can do to increase the cost of invasion is worth considering. I mean, I'm not a military expert, so I can't make comments on specific weaponry and the like, but I think that the impulse to basically help Ukraine defend itself is exactly the right impulse.
Robert, I should get you to comment on that as well. Do you think we should be sending more aggressive weaponry over there?
I do personally. When it comes to harming the Russian incursion that we expect to happen, it is going to be, unfortunately, mortalities that are going to change the mind of the Russian people. Again, the Russian people we're trying to make sure that we are looking at Putin as the enemy, not the Russian people. And he does have to pay attention to what they say and what they think. So if we can help to make sure that in a defensive way, Ukraine is able to make the Mr. Putin pay for any offensive option that he takes, I think that we have to look at that, even though we may not like the idea of exporting weapons.
Although, Valina, I do remember somebody once saying to me, never underestimate the ability of the Russian people to accept more and more suffering. Does Putin count on that at a moment like this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that goes in both directions. Russia is never so strong as it wants to show itself, and Russia is never so weak as it actually wants to be perceived by rivals and competitors. We should keep that in mind. And I fully agree that we should actually look for increasing the price of any incursion or invasion or military attack. That's the only way how to actually provide a credible response, which currently is happening, but as we've heard, is not happening on all fronts. Not all NATO members are convinced of that of this approach, and this is, of course, something that needs to be recalibrated for sure in the long run.
We're down to our last couple of minutes here, and I want to see if I can get a couple of more questions in. Robert, your job, presumably, a part of it, is to convince Canadians that their support of NATO is worth it. Do moments like this help?
I'd say that they do. Most Canadians don't know what NATO is. So to have to bring it into the headlines that they see every day helps to revivify interest in it. And the one thing that got me interested in my job is that NATO is an amazing organization, and it was built out of the knowledge of the death and the suffering that occurred during the Second World War, and it has been built up to avoid such a future conflict out of those lessons. Every time Canadians stand up during November the 11th to remember those who sacrificed themselves, their blood, their toil, it actually really made a manifest the rules-based international order. That is what we are fighting for, to maintain multilateralism. Canada's greatest hope for a secure world and a secure future is through that kind of multilateralism, the rules-based order, and NATO is one of its staunchest defenders. So most Canadians are really waking up to that and realizing that we can't just free ride all the time.
Well, let's find out how much. Lucan, I'm going to give you the last word on this, because there are many Ukrainians right now, as we've heard, who are prepared to put their lives on the line in order to fight for ideals that Westerners have traditionally thought of as ours. Do we think these ideals are important enough to fight and sacrifice for over there? Lucan, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think that Russia is, represents a set of values that is the Putin government, I don't want to say Russia, the Putin government, not Russia as a whole, Putin government now represents a set of values that is fundamentally antithetical to who we are. And therefore, it's really important that we defend those who are combating this kind of behavior.
I want to thank all three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and helping us out with this discussion about a truly frightening and difficult topic. Valina Chakarova, Director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy; Robert Baines, the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada; Lucan Way, the political scientist from the University of Toronto. Thanks, everybody. Be safe, and see you again down the road, I hope.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bill 21 came into effect in 2019 in Quebec. It essentially says that public employees in positions of authority cannot wear religious symbols at work. But for many, including some big city mayors, it means much more than that. With us now on whether it's an inflection point that the rest of Canada ought to weigh in on, let's welcome, in Montreal, Quebec, former independent Senator André Pratt, who is now a principal at Navigator. In Chelsea, Quebec, writer Noha Bashir, and in the nation's capital, Paul Wells, senior writer for Maclean's. And we're very happy to welcome all three of you tonight for this discussion, which, well, I was going to start by saying it's timely, but Paul, that might actually get to the first question, which is this bill passed in 2019, and somehow 2.5 years later, it suddenly became a cause célèbre for some in Quebec and much of English Canada. Can you explain off the top that time lag?
Yeah. What happened is it wasn't until December of 2021 that the law was applied as written and intended. It wasn't until the end of 2021 that a teacher was removed from a classroom for wearing the offending headgear, a Muslim hijab in the specific case at hand. What had happened until then was the bill was introduced and passed. Teachers and other public servants to whom the bill applied, who were already employed at the time of the bill's passage, were sunsetted, grandfathered, however you want to say it. They were in no danger of losing their jobs or being reassigned. It was only new hires, and there were no new hires because school boards understood that this law was in place. And only in 2021 did the West Quebec School Board, needing to find someone to go into a COVID affected classroom, the third new hire in the school year, did they finally hire Madame Envari, the teacher who ended up getting reassigned. They say it was a misunderstanding. They didn't understand that she was going to wear her hijab in the classroom. Some people suggest that it was Western Quebec School Board is an English school board that has never liked Bill 21, and they may have done it to be a test case, but there was no test case until then. And the other half of it is that Quebec is the largest reservoir of swing seats in any federal election. There are many seats in Quebec that have been represented by members of 4 or 5 different parties in the last 30 years. So every party thinks that they might get lucky this time. So every party treads lightly when it comes to Quebec. And even though most ordinary members of the Liberal Party, the NDP, and the Conservatives don't like Bill 21, they decided to keep quiet about it because they were hoping to not blow their chances in Quebec. And the other thing
that explains the time lag, and we'll come back to the politics a little bit later as well.
Yeah.
Noha, I want to bring you in here because you and your family have a direct connection to this story. You want to explain what that is off the top?
Yeah, well, so my children actually go to the school in question. Neither of them were in the affected classroom, but I have a lot of friends whose children are in the affected classroom and who were very concerned and very upset when they heard about it. And so I first heard about it from a friend of mine, actually, while I was out doing groceries. And she called me and said, did you hear about the teacher who was removed? And it was actually in her son's class. And it hit really, really close to home, obviously. And the community was rightly very upset and very, very bothered about this, because this was a class that had, had a teacher that wasn't available, and then they got this teacher and the students all loved her, and then to have her removed, as I understand it, so she's been in my kid's class a few times as well, supply teaching or whatnot, or as a resource teacher. As I understand it, from that specific classroom, they all really, really appreciated her. She was a very creative teacher. She helped kids who were struggling otherwise, maybe with, it's been a really rough couple of years on the children, and we already have a teacher shortage. So to have something like this happen just kind of shows the absurdity of it all.
Although I've seen that you have written that you thought a moment like this was, and I believe the word you used was inevitable. Why did you use that word?
Well, so when I said that it felt inevitable, I was talking about a law like Bill 21, specifically this moment. Yeah, I think it's interesting to me because as a member of the affected community, we were raising the alarm, and we've been saying, hey, there's a problem since 2019 and before it, because before I lived in Chelsea, I also lived in Montreal for quite a while. And when I first moved to Montreal, the reasonable accommodations debate was happening. And it felt like every time I turned on the radio or I read something out there, it was always a discussion about visible minorities and like the issues surrounding visible minorities. So what can people be reasonably expected? What kind of accommodations do we have to give? And I found it really surprising, as someone who grew up in Ottawa and had lived in Ontario my whole life, that this was something that was such a constant topic, because it had never been a topic of my life. I've been a visible minority my whole life, but it had never been made to feel an issue. And in the time that I lived in Montreal, first there was the Reasonable Accommodations Commission or debate, and then shortly thereafter it felt like, okay, that's finally died down. We don't have to feel like the center of everything for a while. Suddenly the Charter of Values was another what felt like a trial balloon. So to me, when one thing after another keeps coming up and they're all almost different flavors of the same discussion, Bill 21 really felt inevitable, because it felt like it's only a matter of time before whichever government will find a way to make this stick, that something that will in one way or another target this community that, there's a problem, obviously, like they feel that there's a problem with religious symbols, and not wanting people to, I take it as not wanting people to participate in public life, like finding a way to keep hijab wearing or religious symbol wearing people out of public life in some capacity or another. And Bill 21 is the one that finally succeeded at doing that.
Well, Andre Pratt, we need to hear from you, and let's set it up by saying that you are talking, obviously, to an overwhelmingly Anglophone audience right now, but I think an audience that wants to have a greater understanding of why Bill 21 is apparently as popular as it is among Francophone Quebecers. Help us understand that, if you would.
Yes, complicated. First of all, I must say that I'm against this bill. I've been against it since it was first introduced, because I think it is discriminatory and goes against both the Canadian Charter of Rights and the Quebec Charter of Rights. I think the issue really here is that most Quebecers have a problem with religion, and that goes back to the times when Quebec was a so-called priest-ridden society, where the Catholic Church had a lot of control not only on public life but also on Quebecers' private lives. And the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s was, amongst other things, an attempt by Francophone Quebecers to get rid of this control of their lives of the Catholic Church, which they did. And the Church now today is much less influential than it was. And so I think many Quebecers see any attempt by other people who practice their religion as an attempt to bring back religion in public life, in schools, in hospitals, and even in government. So that's not an excuse. I think that does not excuse Bill 21, but it may be one part of the explanation why this bill has been so popular, although some polls have shown recently that support is now closer to 50% than over 60% as it was a few months ago. And maybe that's because it became something concrete with this story of the teacher that had to be reassigned because her veil was against the law.
Well, Paul, I think you wrote that you thought Bill 21 was enacted based on, again, your quote here, silly reasoning. What's the silly reasoning you're referring to?
So it is reasoning, more or less what Andre just described, and it's reasoning that I have done more than a lot of my Anglophone colleagues to try and understand and embrace. And I mean, basically the cultural roots of Bill 21 are the fact that it's not a hypothetical in Quebec, the notion that men and women dressed in religious garb might tell you what to do. That's a large and difficult part of the somewhat recent history of Quebec. And so the argument has arisen and been fairly broadly accepted that the state not being an instrument of religion, nobody who acts on behalf of the state may show any sign of adhering to a religion. That the simple act of dressing the way your religion counsels you to dress constitutes proselytism. That if I go to the license bureau and I'm getting my license plate form from someone who's wearing a crucifix, then that person is subtly trying to convert me. I mean, I'm sorry, I have a hard time saying this with a straight face. The idea is that the state must have no religion. But the state has no particular size, and yet tall people and short people can work in the License Bureau. The state has no particular partisan affiliation, and yet every public servant is free to vote and to let people know how they're voting. And for that reason, I've gone down. I've written a piece about the heritage of the culture of the Quiet Revolution as a inspiration for this sort of laws that some of my colleagues in Toronto still make fun of to this day. I've tried hard to buy this. I don't buy it. It is on its by its very nature a bill that imposes the preferences of a majority against minorities. It imposes no cost on people named Wells or Pratt, and only on people whose names are Bashir and Anvari.
Okay. Except that, Andre, well, how do I put this? The notion that, let's take Paul's examples there. Do you think those analogies work? Let's just start there.
I think they do in part. Because, for instance, public officials, certainly in Quebec, cannot wear a sign saying, you know, I'm voting Liberal or I'm voting Conservative or whatever. So there is a distinction. But I listen, I agree that this bill does exactly what Paul said. That is, try to impose the majority's will on minorities, and in particular the minorities' practice of religion, which is why it goes against, it violates both the Canadian and the Quebec Charter. And that's, I think, an argument that surprisingly Quebecers have not heard enough. Many of the bill's opponents or the law's opponents focus on the Canadian Charter, so-called imposed on Quebec in 1982. But this bill pushes aside the 38 first clauses of the Quebec Charter of Rights to protect the law from any challenge based on the right to life or the right to organize or to practice religion or whatever. So, I mean, this bill goes against a charter, Quebec Charter, that was voted unanimously by the National Assembly in 1975, and that up until recently was an object of pride in Quebec. You know, the fact that we had adopted a Charter of Rights unanimously even before the Canadian Charter of Rights came to be. And now, apparently, this is not important anymore. And I mean, I agree with Paul. I find it difficult to to conclude that someone who wears a scarf is trying to convince kids in third grade that they should adopt Islam. I mean, to me, that doesn't make much sense, but it does come from the idea that this is what happened in the past, that priests were trying, Catholic priests, were in fact using the school system to convert kids to the religion, and even in many cases convince them to become priests themselves.
All right, let me pick up this angle then with Noha. There certainly was the suspicion among many Anglophones that Quebec was being incredibly hypocritical when, for example, it said, we have this policy of secularism, we don't want religion anywhere in public life, but we're going to allow this massive crucifix in the National Assembly, that's okay. But those days are gone. They haven't said crucifixes are allowed, they've said nothing is allowed. Do you see anything in that argument that makes sense to you?
I don't, because I think what you're doing is applying, a crucifix hanging on a wall or not hanging on a wall is symbolic, whereas for me, wearing a hijab is a tenet of my faith, and it's something I do as something I have to do as part of my faith. Now, I wouldn't say that any other Muslim woman has to make that choice. It's a deeply personal choice, but it's not the same as like. It's not the same as saying, I have to wear a specific cultural item or wear a verse of the Quran around my neck on a necklace or something like that. The hijab for me is a tenet of my faith, and it's very meaningful and important that I wear it as part of my identity. I don't leave the house without it. So the idea that I can simply take it off if I'm a school teacher or in one of these positions that's affected by the bill, and then put it back on at the end of the day doesn't actually fly, because I need to wear the hijab at all times. Now, the application of saying, well, you know, we have the crucifix on the wall or we don't have the crucifix on the wall, again, what cost does that draw from anyone? So back to Paul's point, if the tenet of my faith that was required, if I was a Christian who wore a cross around my neck and I needed to then tuck it into my shirt to go to work, and that doesn't affect me practicing or not practicing my faith in any way, there's no cost drawn there. But to force a Muslim woman or, you know, a Sikh man, for example, to make the choice between that career, that job, and their faith is a much bigger choice that you're forcing upon someone. So
yes,
I don't
take your
see
point
the
on
two
that.
being equivalent. I think that simplifying that they're all religious symbols and so they're all interchangeable is really an oversimplification.
I take your point on that. But Paul, this often at the end of the day gets down to discussions about who's a majority and who's a minority. And the reality is, Noha may be a minority in the province of Quebec, but Quebecers, of course, are minorities in Canada and in North America. How do you resolve all of those issues about whose minority rights are more important?
Well, I'd be surprised if Andre liked the notion that Quebec is merely a minority within Canada or North America. Quebec is the local national majority in what the House of Commons has recognized as the nation of Quebec. I mean, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. Frankly, majorities impose their cultural preferences on minorities all the time. It's just that that shouldn't be a justification for doing it, and you should weigh offense against remedy carefully in every case. I think that the reason young Quebecers are increasingly unimpressed by the kind of quiet revolution generated arguments that we've been rehearsing for you now is that this is meaningless to them, and they agree with everyone on this panel that Bill 21 is essentially a remedy to a non-existent problem. It's no one's problem if people dress differently. And while the remedies imposed by Bill 21 are not catastrophic, that teacher was not fired. She was reassigned, incidentally, to a task that allows her to continue working as an educator. In slightly more extreme situations, people might decide simply that they can't exercise their craft or their profession in Quebec, and they'll move at limited cost to other very nice Canadian jurisdictions. So I'm trying hard not to say that this is the worst law ever or that it's rank bigotry and so on. But I keep coming back to it's a set of dumb solutions to non-existent problems. I'm afraid that's the best I can say for it.
Dumb solutions to non-existent problems, maybe so, but Andre has been warning English Canada, I think I have this right, not to push too hard against Bill 21, regardless of how much antipathy English Canadians may feel towards it, lest a provocation to a new separatist sentiment in the province be stoked. And I guess, Andre, I'd like you to pick up the story there. How concerned should we be that if English Canada pushes too hard against Bill 21, that we're going to see separatism reborn in the province of Quebec?
Well, the truth is we don't really know. What my concern really is, I mean, I'm not saying that Canadians should not, voice their concern or express their opposition to the bill. I mean, we're in democracy and everyone, and this will, if the bill, the law will come to the Supreme Court, and whatever decision the Supreme Court renders may apply to the rest of the country. So Canadians have the right to express their views on Bill 21. However, I think we should not lose the perspective that the solution to this is for the National Assembly, the Quebec National Assembly, to amend or withdraw this law. And this has better chances of happening if Quebecers themselves are convinced that this is a bad law, and if they pressure the government to amend it, or possibly a government formed by another political party to amend or withdraw the law. So the solution to this problem will not come from Ottawa or from Brantford or from Calgary or whatever government, local or federal, gets involved in this. The solution to the problem is within Quebec, and that's why I'm saying, well, I mean, make sure that in other Canadians, when you get involved in the debate, have a positive impact rather than a negative impact of maybe convincing Quebecers that this has become a Canada versus Quebec issue. And of course, when that happens, Quebecers always defend their provincial governments. That's sort of a reflex. So that's what we should avoid. And I think we can make this debate a debate about Quebecers' fundamental rights, all Quebecers' fundamental rights, and the Quebec Charter, and convince Quebecers. And apparently polls show that more and more Quebecers are convinced that this is a bad law that should be withdrawn.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, because if I'm reading between the lines properly, it sounds like you're saying you approve of the approach that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has taken to this, which is to say, my preference is not, the Prime Minister's preference is not to get involved in this, but rather have Quebecers resolve this themselves. That would be the best possible outcome. Fair?
I'd add a couple of nuances there. I mean, I don't think, for instance, some people have suggested that the federal government should use its disallowance power and cancel or delete the bill. I don't think that's a good solution at all, because that would provoke a very strong reaction in Quebec. But I do think that if someone can stand up and defend in his speeches and whatever, can defend the Canadian Charter and Canadians' fundamental rights, that's the Prime Minister. So I'm not sure I understand exactly why, for instance, the federal government is not involved in the case in front of the Quebec Appeals Court. I mean, this law clearly flies into the face of the Canadian Charter, and the federal government, the government of Canada, should defend Canadian laws.
Having said that, Noha, let me ask you, do you understand why Prime Minister Trudeau has felt a need to tread very carefully as he either does or does not involve the federal government to a greater or lesser extent in the court challenge on this?
I'm definitely, I understand that it's complex for all the reasons that Andre described. And I do feel that a lot of this is maybe politically motivated, staying quiet about it, saying you're offended the questions even asked, for example, in a debate. That feels more politically motivated than anything else to me. Not striking down the law, I understand that for the reasons that Andre's mentioned. But I just have to say that there's a personal cost to this. Like, we can debate it, you know, in a more theoretical level, but there's a personal cost to this, not just to the specific people who are influenced by the law because they can't work in specific roles in Quebec. And to Paul's point earlier, there are people I've spoken to who say, oh, you know, I might have to move, or I don't know that I can live here with this question. Maybe those who have been grandfathered in can stay in their jobs, but there's all sorts of bright young people who are looking to be lawyers or looking to be judges or looking to be teachers who can't do that now, and who are concerned that, okay, you know, I can wait 5 years, but what if another 5 years after that, someone introduces something different? None of it's a guarantee. So there's a personal effect that way. And then there's also a personal effect on people like myself who aren't directly influenced by the law. And yet what I've found is that when these conversations happen, when the center debate in the province where I live, so I'm a Quebecer, I live in Quebec, and when the debate is about this stuff, this is the time that I experience more microaggressions, that people around me, and the numbers bear it out, experience more hate crimes and things like that. So even if I'm not directly influenced by in my workplace, this kind of discussion ongoing about what we need to do about minorities in this way or that way emboldens those who are racist to act out on that behavior in whichever way they're going to act out on it. And that's something that we have to deal with over and over. It's an extra burden on top of, everybody's going through a lot right now with COVID and with everything. So adding an extra burden on that is just not a lot of fun. So I do understand, the Prime Minister not trying to strike down the law altogether, but refusing to even really truly answer questions about it. Paul, I read your piece recently about this, and finding politicians who are trying to find the to say the least possible words in the longest way, it's quite disappointing, right? Because it's not a theoretical debate. It's got a very personal impact on a large swath of the population, or maybe not a large swath, and that's the whole issue, where it's not a big enough voting block to matter to any specific politician. So how can they give the most meaningless soundbite and then move on?
I got a minute left, Paul, to get your views on, we've talked about Justin Trudeau. There's another leader in that House of Commons, though, who wears a turban, and he hasn't had a lot to say in pushback to Bill 21 as well. And I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, Jagmeet Singh is making more or less the same calculation that other people are, and perhaps all the more so because he faced a lot of questions and a lot of criticism when he became the federal NDP leader, because he was seen as essentially a one-issue Sikh nationalist politician who had gone into federal politics to pursue that, and so he's had to make it really clear that that's not the case. That he's the full buffet of concerns and interests and policies, just like all the other federal leaders. But Noha touches on an element of this that I really don't like, which is everyone else in Canada is having this debate except for the leaders of our federal parties, because they're making essentially cheap bets on potentially kind of accidentally winning 20 or 30 seats in Quebec, instead of talking to Quebecers like adults. And while I didn't agree with Andre that the rest of us should watch what we say or stay out, I will say that people in Quebec are perfectly capable of discussing this in like adults, including using some of the scary words like discrimination and minority rights and things like that. So the rest of us should feel free to join them and discuss this and many other issues with the richness and the delicacy that they deserve, rather than resorting to slogans and shouting down brown-skinned women journalists for asking questions in debates.
Understood. That's Paul Wells from Maclean's. We also thank Andre Pratt from Navigator, the former senator, and Noha Bashir, who, although in Chelsea, Quebec, is a big Montreal Canadiens fan, and we normally don't allow them on the agenda, but we make an exception tonight. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, January 26, 2022. Tomorrow, a conversation with former Conservative MP Lisa Raitt about the odyssey of caring for her husband who has early onset Alzheimer's. Now, before we go, coming right up after this program on TVO is the first broadcast of a project that Nam Kiwanuka has been working on. It's called The Thread, and it's an engaging blend of digital content and online conversation. Let's have a look.
I used to live here at 389 Church Street in downtown Toronto. I rented a room for about $50. I shared a kitchen and a bathroom with 4 other young women. If I hadn't been able to get a room in that building, I probably would have ended up living on the streets. I was one of the lucky ones. Housing affordability has been in the headlines for a while now, and the situation seems to be getting even more complicated as more Canadians are being priced out of buying or even leasing a home. How did we get here? Instead of more studies conducted on the why, where is the political will to affect change?
Cool. The show's called The Thread. It's been building online on Instagram for several weeks now. Tonight's episode, as you saw, is about housing affordability. The next one is about food costs and is already percolating online to find out what Ontarians are talking about. You can check it all out on Instagram at TVO The Thread and then online at tvo.org, The Thread. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. We'll see you again tomorrow. Now stay tuned for the premiere episode of The Thread with Nam Kiwanuka.